Looking to create a shared history of humanity, human zoos began appearing all over the world in the 1800s, from Mexico City to the Vatican. Put together by anthropologists, entrepreneurs, and missionaries, these mock ethnic villages brought people from hundreds of cultures from around the world into one area. This allowed people of the 1800s to see what other cultures looked like firsthand in an era before cinema and YouTube. Required to wear traditional clothing despite the change in environment, these zoos were really made for entertainment as opposed to scientific inquiry. For example, in France, the Jardin d'Agronomie Tropicale had an exhibit at the Paris Colonial Exhibition in 1907 where they brought indigenous cultures from around different parts of the world in these mock villages. Each village had colonial performers who had to wear the traditional garments of the cultures they were coming from in order to make these exhibitions a reality for the Westerners who were coming to see them in these zoos. Poor living conditions, lots of diseases, and a lack of appropriate attire for these kind of weathers that the people were not used to led to a large number of deaths, and many were buried in mass graves on site. Closed only a few months after opening to the public, the gardens and villages are still open for the public to see, of course without their human inhabitants. In 1904, the World Fair in St. Louis, Missouri created a recreated indigenous Filipino village in which 1,000 people from a variety of tribes from the region were kept for display. The most popular of these was the Agora village, advertised as being one of the most uncivilized of the world. Dressed in minimal clothing for that environment, the Igorot were given dog every day to eat for the Westerners to enjoy. Now the reality is that group only ate dog at very specific times of the year for ceremonial purposes, but this didn't really matter to the entertainers who were really looking to draw a public crowd in. Eventually, following protests from the Filipino community, the exposition was closed in 1914. At the same fair, a Congolese man from the Pygmy tribe known as Oda Benga made his debut. Once the fair closed, he was moved to the Bronx Zoo in the pretense that he was to take care of the elephant exhibit. Instead, he was exhibited in a cage with a number of bones placed all along the cage bottom to make him look more threatening, and he was actually advertised as a missing link in human evolution. Thousands of people came to see him every single day as he shot at targets in this cage, wrestled with an orangutan, and wove twine in what was considered a very uncivilized and primitive way of life. Protests by colored Baptist ministers at the time eventually won him his freedom. But despite an attempt to integrate him into the rest of American society, Oda Benga eventually committed suicide in 1916. In Germany, Karl Hagenbeck, an exotic animals dealer, started bringing people back with his animals from around the world in order to have caretakers for these exhibits. He set up traditional houses for his workers, and over time, the general public began to flock to see his workers actually caring for the animals. He began to have people from Sudanese backgrounds, Samoan backgrounds, and even Inuit backgrounds. The Ulrikab family was an Inuk family from Hebron, Labrador, who agreed to come back with Hagenbeck in order to take care of his animals as well as be part of his ethnographical shows in Germany. Abraham, the patriarch of the family, agreed to move to Europe in order to take care of these animals as it would help him settle some of his debts back home. In 1880, the family boarded a schooner bound for Europe and were exhibited at the Berlin Zoo for about 2 months before making their way to Hamburg. However, as they moved to Hamburg, one by one, the family began to get sick. The recruiter who had brought them from Labrador had neglected to get them vaccinated for smallpox, despite it being law in Germany at the time. And within 4 months, the family had all died. The reality of the human zoos at the time was that instead of being there for scientific purposes, it was really just a way for the Europeans to justify their ownership and their position at the top of the hierarchy amongst all other cultures on planet Earth. These zoos just fed into the popular idea of the time that humanity was on a hierarchy where European civilization was at the top and every other form before that was just a matter of uncivilized life in which each would eventually, if they were allowed to, get to this top position. Now, of course, none of this was really true, and it was really just a way for the Europeans to justify their genocide in many of the other parts of the world. While it would be nice to say that humans learned the errors of their ways, the reality is that the only reason these human zoos stopped was because there was a much larger threat looming in Europe. 2 world wars and the invention of television later, these human zoos are now a part of our history, which serve as an important reminder as to what happens when our thirst for entertainment and our thirst for rationalizing our own preconceived notions overtake our use of scientific rigor. I'll see you next week.